We have a beautiful collection of enamels here at Bantock House in Wolverhampton and also at Bilston Craft Gallery. This one here is one of my particular favourites. It's shaped like a tricorn hat and it's actually a patch box as opposed to a snuff box. We can tell that this one is a patch box because if you turn it over and lift the little lid underneath, there's actually a small mirror inside. And the mirror inside the patch box would have been used to position them on their face. The mirrors can actually help us to date the patch boxes because prior to 1785 the mirrors were made from polished steel, whereas from then on the box makers learned how to put glass into the boxes, so that does help us to date them. The patches were made from either taffeta or silk or felt, and they would have a gum on the back and people would stick them to their faces. They were used to cover pock marks on people's faces because at that time in the 1700s smallpox was prevalent and a lot of people suffered from the disease and were left with nasty scarrings on their face. So the patches were a very useful cosmetic as a makeup to cover the patches. Later they were also very fashionable with ladies and gentlemen of Georgian society. The fashion for wearing patches in the 1700s could almost be likened to young people today having body piercings and wearing jewellery on their face. In fact, some of the patches that were worn in the 1700s weren't simple dot shapes, but they had patterns like crescents or suns on them. They also sent messages. Wearing patches in certain ways on your face could send messages across the room to a lover indiscreetly. And for example, wearing a patch on the side of your eye indicated passion. The foundation for the boxes was a copper base which was enamelled onto. The copper was very finely rolled and then pressed into these shapes, and then the fixings, the hinges fitted later, they were fired to produce the enamel finish on them and then decorated and fired again. And this one is a hand-painted one with a picture of a horse. Horses and other sporting animals were quite often featured on these. Although a lot of the patch boxes are either round or oval shapes, there are some of them in fantastic shapes like this one here, which is shaped like a bird. Again, when we lift the lid, there's a mirror inside. This particular mirror has a label indicating where this came, what a collection this originally came from. There's another oval one here that has a very good clear mirror inside that's still intact. A lot of the small enamel boxes that we have in the collection have a motif on the top. This one here says in remembrance of a friendship, and they were often given as gifts. An enamel that I find particularly interesting is one in the collection at Bilston. The image on the front is of a house in Bilston. It says a trifle from Bilston and it has Sam Proud's house underneath. And Sam Proud was the keeper of the lunatic asylum in Bilston at that time. And this was one that was made for him to give as a gift by a member of the Bickley family who were particularly prevalent enamel makers in that time in Bilston. Although the boxes that I have here are all patch boxes because they do have the mirror inside, we do have a lot of snuff boxes in the collection, which again are particularly interesting. And in Georgian society, there was actually a 12-point etiquette of taking snuff among the worthy gentlemen. The whole process began when the gentleman opened his waistcoat to place his hand inside and draw out the snuff box, and from then on there were a 12-point procedure of opening the lid and taking the snuff, placing it on your hand, sniffing it, closing the lid and placing it back in your pocket. And gentlemen in the fashionable coffee and chocolate houses of Georgian society would have followed that etiquette. The industry did die out towards the end of the 18th century. And by 1780 there weren't many people still making them. The production had almost ceased, in Bilston anyway particularly. Theories about why the production ceased. At that time, well, first of all, they last a long time. Once they've been made, it's not something that you need to replace once you've got one. If you're keeping it proudly on your sideboard, you will only ever need one if you're using it as a snuff box or as a patch box. So for that reason, it wasn't something that would wear out and would need replacing. And then also because at that time metal industries and armaments were being prepared for the Franco-Prussian War, presumably fancy goods like these would go out of production in favour of those industries.